The shuttle's engines hummed quietly as it approached the strange crystal structure floating in space. David Cross pressed his face against the small window and watched the Galactic Federation's Grand Assembly Hall grow larger. It looked like someone had carved a mountain out of pure diamond and set it spinning among the stars. Flexed his scarred fingers and tried not to think about the last time he had been in a room full of people who wanted to judge him. That had been a military tribunal after the mess on Europa. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be about peace and friendship between species. The docking bay doors opened with a soft hiss. David grabbed his small travel bag and walked down the ramp. The gravity felt lighter here than on Earth, making each step feel like a small bounce. Alien beings moved around the docking area, some tall and thin like walking trees, others short and covered in what looked like blue fur. None of them paid much attention to the human visitor. A guide approached him. She had smooth gray skin and 4 arms. Her voice came from a small device attached to her throat that translated her words into English. Captain Cross, welcome to the Grand Assembly Hall. I am Guide Nira. The Council is ready to see you. David nodded. Thank you. How long will this take? That depends entirely on how the Council feels about your species application. Some meetings last days. Others are over quickly. They walked through corridors made of the same crystal material as the outside of the station. Light seemed to flow through the walls like water. David could see other beings through the transparent sections going about their daily work. Everything looked clean and peaceful. Has your species ever had a war? David asked as they walked. Guide Nira's 4 arms moved in what might have been a shrug. My people had a disagreement with our neighbors about mining rights 50 years ago. It lasted 3 days before we worked out a trade agreement. Why do you ask? David did not answer right away. 3 days was not a war. 3 days was barely a skirmish. On Earth, some battles lasted longer than that entire conflict. The corridor opened into a massive circular room with a high ceiling that seemed to stretch up forever. 7 raised platforms surrounded a small area in the center, where a single chair waited. Each platform held a different type of alien being. David recognized some of them from the briefing materials Earth's diplomats had given him. The beings on the platforms looked down at him with various types of eyes. Some had 2 eyes like humans, others had more. One creature that looked like it was made of living metal had a single large eye in the center of what might have been its face. Captain, David Cross of Earth, announced Guide Nira. You may take your seat. David sat in the chair and looked up at the council. The room was so quiet he could hear his own breathing. He had been in many tense situations before, but this felt different. These beings would decide if humanity could join their galactic community, or if Earth would remain isolated. A tall, pale being with long white hair stood up on the platform directly in front of him. When it spoke, its voice was soft and musical. I am Counselor Vrain of the Ethereal Collective. We have reviewed your species' application to join our federation. Your planet shows promise in several areas. You have interesting art, diverse cultures, and your technology, while primitive, shows potential for growth. David kept his expression neutral. He had expected this kind of condescending tone from beings who thought they were more advanced than humanity. Another council member spoke. This one looked like a large bird with colorful feathers and a sharp beak. Your industrial capacity could be useful for certain types of manufacturing. We have identified several asteroid systems near your solar system that could provide raw materials for Federation projects. A third council member joined the conversation. This being was short and stocky with rock-like skin. The Federation values diversity. Your species would add an interesting perspective to our cultural exchanges. David listened to them talk about humanity like they were discussing a business deal. They mentioned trade routes, resource extraction, and cultural contributions. Everything was very polite and very formal, but he noticed what they were not talking about. What about security? David asked during a pause in the conversation. Counselor Vrain tilted its head. Security? Defense. Military matters. Protecting Federation territory and citizens. The council members exchanged glances. A few of them made sounds that might have been laughter. The bird-like being spoke next. Captain Cross, the Federation has enjoyed peace for over 200 years. Our combined fleets patrol the borders and respond to minor incidents. Pirates, smugglers, the occasional territorial dispute between member species. Nothing that requires extensive military experience. We have reviewed your species' history, added the rock-skinned being. "You seem to have a tendency toward conflict. This is concerning, but we believe exposure to Federation values will help your people mature beyond such primitive behaviors." David felt a familiar tightness in his chest. It was the same feeling he got right before a battle when he knew the enemy had no idea what they were facing. Counselor Vrain stood again. "Perhaps you could help us understand something, Captain Cross. Our records show that your species has experienced various disagreements throughout your history, some lasting several years. We need to know if you have any practical experience with actual military operations." The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. David looked at each council member slowly. He saw beings who had lived their entire lives in peaceful societies. They had never seen a real war. They had never lost friends to enemy fire. They had never had to make the choice between saving themselves or saving their squad. These aliens thought humanity's wars were just disagreements. They thought human military experience was limited to minor conflicts. They had no idea that Earth had been shaped by thousands of years of constant warfare. They did not understand that every human alive was descended from survivors of conflicts that would terrify most galactic civilizations. David leaned forward slightly in his chair. His voice was calm and steady when he spoke. "Counselor Vrain, you want to know if I have seen combat? That is correct. We need to assess whether your species can contribute meaningfully to Federation defense operations." David was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the battles on Mars, the desperate fighting in the asteroid belt, the urban warfare on Europa. He thought about friends who had died in his arms and enemies who had earned his respect through their courage. He thought about the weight of command and the responsibility of sending soldiers into situations where not everyone would come home. When he looked up at the council again, his eyes had changed. The polite diplomatic expression was gone, replaced by something much older and much more dangerous. "Counselor Vrain," he said quietly, "do you want a testimony or a demonstration?" The silence in the Grand Assembly Hall stretched like a wire pulled too tight. David's question echoed off the crystal walls while the 7 council members looked at each other with various expressions of confusion. Counselor Vrain's pale features showed what might have been amusement. Its musical voice filled the chamber when it finally responded. "Captain Cross, I think there may be a translation error. Could you repeat your question? You asked if I had seen combat. I asked if you want a testimony or a demonstration." The bird-like council member ruffled its colorful feathers. "We simply want to understand your military background, Captain. A verbal report will be sufficient." David nodded slowly. "A testimony, then." He stood up from his chair and began to pace in the small circle at the center of the room. The council members watched him with mild interest, like scientists observing an interesting but harmless specimen. "I joined Earth's Colonial Marine Corps when I was 18 years old. That was 26 years ago. In those 26 years, I have served in 43 separate military campaigns across 12 different worlds and moons." The rock-skinned council member leaned forward. 43 campaigns? That seems excessive for territorial disputes. The Martian Independence War lasted 7 years. The Europa Uprising took 3 years to put down. The Titan mining conflict ran for 2 years. The Belt Wars. David paused and looked directly at Counselor Vrain. The Belt Wars have been going on for 15 years. A new council member spoke for the first time. This being looked like it was made of living water contained in a transparent shell. Its voice bubbled like a stream over rocks. "Captain, these sound like significant conflicts. How many casualties did your species suffer in these wars? The Martian War alone cost us 3 million dead. Europa was another 800,000. Titan was relatively small, only 50,000 casualties. The Belt Wars..." David stopped pacing and looked up at the council. "We stopped counting Belt War casualties when we reached 10 million. The chamber fell completely silent. Even the soft hum of the station's life support system seemed to fade away. Several council members shifted uncomfortably on their platforms. The metal being with the single large eye spoke in a voice like grinding machinery. "Captain Cross, are you telling us that your species has lost over 14 million individuals to warfare in the last few decades?" "Those are just the major conflicts. There were dozens of smaller wars, rebellions, and police actions. Border disputes between Earth nations, corporate conflicts over mining rights, religious wars in the outer colonies." David shrugged. "War is what we do. Counselor Vrain's musical voice had lost some of its pleasant tone. Captain, the Federation has experienced fewer than 100 combat deaths in the past 50 years. Your numbers suggest that your species is extraordinarily violent. No, David replied firmly. Our species is extraordinarily good at violence. There is a difference. The bird-like being flapped its wings nervously. Good at violence. What do you mean? David resumed his pacing. We learn from every conflict. Every battle teaches us something new about tactics, strategy, weapons, logistics, psychology. When we fight, we do not just try to win. We study our enemies, we adapt, we improve. But why do you fight so much? Asked the water being. Surely peaceful solutions exist for most disputes. Sometimes they do. But when peaceful solutions fail, someone has to be ready for what comes next. David looked around the chamber. How many of you have ever killed another sentient being? The question hit the council like a physical blow. Several members recoiled visibly. The metal being's single eye flickered rapidly. Captain Cross, Counselor Vrain said stiffly, that is not an appropriate question for a diplomatic meeting. It is absolutely appropriate. You want to know about my military experience. Combat is not about strategy or tactics or logistics. Combat is about being willing and able to kill your enemies before they kill you. Everything else is just preparation. The rock-skinned being made a grinding sound that might have been distress. Captain, we are a peaceful federation. We solve our problems through discussion and compromise. What happens when you meet someone who does not want to discuss or compromise? That has never occurred, admitted the bird-like being. David stopped pacing and looked directly at Counselor Vrain. It will. How can you be so certain? Because the galaxy is a big place. Somewhere out there is a species that takes what it wants by force. A species that sees your peaceful federation as prey. A species that will not listen to your diplomatic messages or respect your trade agreements. David's voice grew harder. When you meet that species, you will need people who know how to fight. The metal being's eye focused on David like a targeting system. And you believe humans are those people? I know we are. Counselor Vrain stood up on its platform. Its pale features had taken on a greenish tint. Captain Cross, your species' history of violence is deeply troubling. Perhaps humanity is not ready for Federation membership. You asked me about my combat experience. I am telling you about it. You are describing mass slaughter. David's expression did not change. I am describing survival. The water being bubbled anxiously. Captain, surely you understand our concerns. How can we welcome a species that has killed so many of its own kind? Those wars made us stronger. Every conflict taught us lessons that kept us alive in the next one. Every battle showed us new ways to protect what matters. David looked up at each council member in turn. Right now, somewhere in this galaxy, there is a threat growing. A species or empire or collective that will not be interested in your peaceful ways. When that threat comes, you will need defenders who have already paid the price of learning how to fight. And if we refuse your membership application, asked Counselor Vrain coldly, then you will face that threat alone. The bird-like being ruffled its feathers again. Captain, are you threatening us? I am stating a fact. The galaxy is not as peaceful as you believe it is. Your Federation has been lucky so far. That luck will not last forever. Counselor Vrain descended from its platform and walked closer to David. Up close, it was even taller than it had appeared from a distance. Its white hair flowed like liquid silver, and its eyes were completely black. Captain Cross, let us assume for a moment that you are correct. That humanity's violent history has given your species useful military skills. How could we verify such claims? David looked up at the towering alien being. The same way you verify anything else. Through observation. You mentioned a demonstration earlier. I did. What exactly did you mean by that? David was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But every being in the chamber heard him clearly. I meant that if you want to see what human combat training produces, I can show you. Counselor Vrain's black eyes seemed to grow even darker. That would be educational. It would be that. The alien turned to address the other council members. What does the council think? Should we arrange a demonstration of human military capabilities? The other beings exchanged glances and made various sounds of agreement. They were clearly curious about what this small, scarred human could actually do. Very well, announced Counselor Vrain. Captain Cross, we will arrange for you to demonstrate human combat skills in our military training facility. This will help us better understand your species' potential contributions to Federation defense. David nodded once. When? 3 days from now. That should give us time to prepare appropriate scenarios. What kind of scenarios? Counselor Vrain's musical voice took on what might have been a patronizing tone. Standard military exercises. Defense simulations. Combat against automated opponents. Nothing too challenging, of course. We simply want to observe your techniques. David looked around the chamber one more time. These beings had no idea what they were asking for. They thought they were arranging a simple training exercise. They expected to see tactics that were perhaps slightly more aggressive than their own peaceful methods. They were about to learn that human warfare was not just slightly different from their experience. It was something else entirely. 3 days, David agreed. I will be ready. As he walked out of the assembly hall, he could hear the council members talking among themselves in excited voices. They were looking forward to their demonstration. They thought it would be entertaining. David almost felt sorry for them. The transport shuttle carrying David to the training facility was much smaller than the diplomatic vessel that had brought him to the Grand Assembly Hall. Through the viewport, he could see a gray moon covered with geometric structures that looked like they had grown out of the rock itself. This is Training Complex Sigma, announced the pilot, a being with 6 arms and skin that changed colors as it spoke, built by the architects 300 years ago. All Federation military personnel complete their basic training here. David studied the facility as they approached. The buildings were elegant and curved, designed more for beauty than for function. Gardens and parks were scattered between the training areas. It looked more like a university campus than a military base. The shuttle landed on a pad surrounded by flowering trees. David gathered his few belongings and walked down the ramp. The air smelled like honey and rain. In the distance, he could see groups of alien beings moving through what appeared to be exercise routines. Their movements were slow and graceful. Waiting for him at the landing pad was a military officer wearing a uniform made of some kind of flexible metal fabric. The being was tall and thin with 4 legs and 2 arms. Its head was elongated and had multiple eyes arranged around its skull. Captain Cross. I am Commander Thex of the Federation Defense. Course, I will be overseeing your demonstration, Commander. David nodded respectfully. The Council has requested a comprehensive evaluation of human military capabilities. We have prepared several scenarios that should give us a good understanding of your training and tactics. They began walking toward the main training complex. Other beings stopped their activities to watch the human visitor. David noticed that their weapons were sleek and clean, designed with smooth curves and bright colors. Everything looked ceremonial rather than practical. Commander Thex, how often does the Federation military see actual combat? Real combat? The commander's multiple eyes blinked in sequence. The last significant engagement was 67 years ago. Pirates had taken control of a mining station. Our forces negotiated their surrender after a 3-day standoff. No one was killed? Killed? Commander Thex stopped walking and turned to face David. Captain, the Federation military does not kill. We disable, we contain, we negotiate. Violence is always a last resort, and even then we use minimal force. David nodded slowly. What if minimal force is not enough? It is always enough. Our weapons are designed to incapacitate without causing permanent harm. Our tactics focus on overwhelming opponents with superior numbers and technology rather than destructive firepower. They entered the main training building. The walls were covered with displays showing various alien species demonstrating combat techniques. Everything David saw emphasized restraint, precision, and minimal damage. The aliens fought like they were performing a dance. Here is your equipment, Commander Thex said, gesturing to a table covered with Federation weapons and armor. Standard-issue defensive systems. Energy shields, non-lethal pulse weapons, communication gear, medical supplies. David picked up one of the pulse weapons. It was lightweight and ergonomically designed, but it felt fragile in his hands. The power setting was locked at what appeared to be its lowest level. Can I adjust the power output? The weapons are pre-configured for training exercises. Maximum safe levels only. What about live ammunition? Commander Thex's multiple eyes focused on David with alarm. Live ammunition? Captain, these are training scenarios. We use holographic opponents and non-lethal systems only. David set the weapon back on the table. Commander, you asked for a demonstration of human military capabilities. Yes, but within safe parameters. There is nothing safe about combat. This is not real combat. This is a training exercise. David looked around the room. The walls showed images of aliens using their weapons to stun opponents or create barriers of energy. Everything was designed to avoid permanent harm. Commander Thex, may I ask you something? Of course. What happens if you encounter an enemy that does not want to be stunned or contained? An enemy that wants to kill you and everyone you are trying to protect? That situation has never arisen. But if it did? Commander Thex was quiet for a long moment. Several of its eyes closed while others remained focused on David. I suppose we would request additional forces and attempt to negotiate. And if they refuse to negotiate? We would find another solution. David picked up the Federation armor. It was designed to absorb energy weapons and cushion impacts, but it would not stop a blade or a projectile weapon. It was protection against accidents, not against someone trying to kill the wearer. Commander, the scenarios you have planned, what do they involve? Defensive operations primarily. Protecting a facility from intruders. Rescuing hostages from a hijacked transport. Containing a riot without casualties. Standard peacekeeping missions. What if I told you that human military doctrine approaches all of those situations differently? How so? David was quiet while he considered how to explain concepts that these aliens had never needed to understand. We do not fight to contain or disable. We fight to win completely and permanently. When we engage an enemy, our goal is to eliminate their ability to threaten anyone ever again. Commander Thex's multiple eyes blinked rapidly. Eliminate? Destroy their weapons, capture their leaders, break their will to fight. Make it impossible for them to continue their aggression. But what about minimizing casualties? We minimize our own casualties by maximizing theirs. The commander stepped back from David. Captain, that sounds extremely aggressive. It is effective, but surely there are rules. Limitations on what you can do in combat? David nodded. Rules of engagement, yes. Laws of war. Codes of conduct. But all of those rules exist within a framework where the ultimate goal is victory, not negotiation. Commander Thex led David to another room filled with holographic projection equipment. The space could generate realistic environments and populate them with computer-controlled opponents. This is where your demonstration will take place. The Council will observe from the protected viewing area above us. The commander pointed to a gallery of transparent material that overlooked the training space. What kind of opponents will I face? Holographic simulations based on various threat profiles from our databases. Pirates, smugglers, rogue traders, computer opponents programmed to use standard criminal tactics. David looked up at the observation gallery. He could imagine the council members sitting comfortably in their chairs, expecting to see a slightly more aggressive version of their own restrained combat methods. Commander, these threat profiles, are they based on actual encounters? Some of them. Others are theoretical projections. Have any of your opponents ever used tactics designed specifically to kill Federation personnel? Commander Thex paused. To kill? No, I do not believe so. Most criminal organizations want to avoid escalation with Federation forces. They typically withdraw when confronted with military response. What if they did not withdraw? Then we would adapt our response accordingly. David picked up a Federation combat helmet. It had a full heads-up display with communication links, tactical overlays, and threat analysis systems. Very advanced, but designed for situations where everyone followed the same basic rules. Commander Thex, when the demonstration begins, I need you to understand something very important. What is that?
I am going to fight these scenarios the way a human fights.
Not the way the Federation fights. What does that mean? David looked directly at the commander with all of its multiple eyes. It means I am going to show you what warfare looks like when the enemy wants to kill you. Commander Thex was quiet for several seconds. When it finally spoke, its voice had changed. Captain Cross, perhaps we should discuss the parameters of this demonstration with the Council before proceeding. The Council asked for a demonstration. They will get one. But if your methods are significantly different from our own, then you will learn something new. David began putting on the Federation armor. It did not fit quite right, designed for alien body proportions, but it would serve its purpose. Commander, there is one thing I need you to do. What is that? When the demonstration starts, make sure all non-essential personnel are out of this facility. Why? David finished adjusting the armor and picked up the pulse weapon. He checked its settings and power levels one more time. Because once I start fighting, I do not stop until the enemy is completely defeated. But these are just holographic opponents. I know that. But the Council does not understand what they are about to see. Some of them might find it disturbing. Commander Thex's multiple eyes focused on David with what might have been concern. Captain Cross, exactly what are you planning to do? David looked up at the observation gallery where the Council members would soon be watching. He thought about their peaceful lives and their gentle combat methods. He thought about their complete inexperience with real warfare. I'm going to show them why humans are still alive. The observation gallery buzzed with quiet conversation as the 7 Council members took their seats. Through the transparent walls, they had a perfect view of the training chamber below where David Cross stood waiting in Federation military gear. Councillor Vrain leaned back in its chair with evident satisfaction. This should be quite educational. I am curious to see how primitive military techniques compare to our modern methods. The bird-like council member preened its colorful feathers. Our analysts predict the human will demonstrate slightly more aggressive tactics than our own forces, but nothing particularly remarkable. Below in the training chamber, Commander Thex made final adjustments to the holographic systems. Banks of projectors hummed to life, ready to create realistic environments and opponents on command. Captain Cross, the commander announced through the communication system, we will begin with Scenario 1, Facility Defense. You must protect a research station from a group of raiders attempting to steal valuable equipment. Standard Federation protocol calls for establishing defensive perimeters and negotiating with the intruders. David nodded and took position at the center of the chamber. The holographic projectors activated, and suddenly he was standing in what appeared to be a research facility with corridors branching off in multiple directions. Banks of computers and scientific equipment lined the walls. Begin simulation, Commander Thex announced. The first group of holographic raiders appeared at the far end of the main corridor. They moved slowly and deliberately, checking corners and communicating with each other in hushed voices. David could see they were armed with standard criminal weapons, jury-rigged energy pistols and basic body armor. David raised his Federation pulse weapon and aimed carefully at the lead raider. Following standard Federation protocol, he targeted the intruder's weapon rather than the person holding it. The non-lethal pulse struck the raider's pistol, causing it to spark and shut down. In the observation gallery, the council members nodded approvingly. Excellent technique, commented the water being. Disable the weapon. Neutralize the threat without harm. The disabled raider raised its hands and backed away from the conflict. Its companions also began to retreat, following the programmed behavior of criminals who preferred to avoid armed confrontation. Very good, announced Commander Thex. The raiders are withdrawing. Mission accomplished with 0 casualties. But David did not lower his weapon. Instead, he moved forward down the corridor, pursuing the retreating raiders. Captain Cross, Commander Thex called out. The threat has been neutralized. There is no need to pursue. David ignored the commander and continued advancing. When he reached the intersection where the raiders had taken cover, he did something that made the council members sit up in their chairs. He threw his weapon around the corner ahead of himself, drawing return fire, then immediately rolled into the intersection from a different angle while the raiders were distracted by the thrown weapon. What is he doing? Asked the rock-skinned council member. David had flanked the raiders' position. Instead of stunning them one at a time with careful shots, he rapidly disabled all 3 remaining intruders with quick, precise bursts from his recovered weapon. Interesting, admitted Councillor Vrain. More dynamic than our standard approach, but still within acceptable parameters. Begin Scenario 2, announced Commander Thex. Hostage rescue. Armed criminals have taken control of a passenger transport and are threatening to harm civilians unless their demands are met. The holographic environment shifted. David now stood outside what appeared to be a space transport. Through the viewports, he could see holographic passengers, huddled together while armed figures moved among them. Standard Federation protocol called for establishing communication with the hostage takers and beginning negotiations while additional forces surrounded the transport. David studied the situation for exactly 12 seconds. Then he moved to the transport's maintenance airlock and began overriding the entry controls. Captain Cross, Commander Thex called out. Standard procedure requires establishing dialogue with the hostage takers first. David finished overriding the airlock and slipped inside the transport. The council members leaned forward in their seats as they watched him move through the ship's service corridors instead of entering through the main passenger areas where the hostage takers expected any rescue attempt. "He is not following our protocols," observed the metal. Being inside the transport, David had positioned himself above the passenger compartment. Through the ventilation system, he could see 3 hostage takers armed with energy weapons. They were facing the main entrances, expecting Federation forces to announce themselves and attempt to negotiate. What happened next made several council members recoil in shock. David dropped through a ceiling panel directly behind the first hostage taker and disabled him with the butt of his weapon before the holographic figure could react. He immediately dove behind a row of seats as the other 2 criminals opened fire at his position. But David was not where they expected him to be. He had rolled under the seats and come up behind them from a different angle. Both remaining hostage takers were disabled before they could redirect their fire. The entire rescue operation had taken less than 30 seconds. "Scenario complete," announced Commander Thex in a voice that sounded somewhat strained. "All hostages secured, all threats neutralized." In the observation gallery, the council members were no longer relaxed in their chairs. Several were sitting forward, studying David's movements with new attention. "His tactics are quite direct," commented the bird-like being. "Begin Scenario 3, Commander Thex announced after a pause. "Riot control. A group of protesters has become violent and is threatening to damage critical infrastructure. Contain the situation without casualties." The holographic environment changed again. David now stood at the edge of what appeared to be a public plaza filled with dozens of agitated beings throwing objects and advancing toward a power generation facility. Standard Federation approach called for forming a defensive line and using sonic barriers to push the rioters back while negotiators worked to calm the situation. David took one look at the scenario and did something that made Commander Thex's multiple eyes blink rapidly. He began moving through the crowd of rioters instead of away from them. "What is he doing now?" asked the water being nervously. David was not trying to stop the entire riot. Instead, he was identifying and rapidly disabling the rioters who were carrying weapons or leading the more aggressive actions. He moved through the crowd like water, never staying in one place long enough for the holographic rioters to organize against him. Within minutes, the riot was collapsing. Without their leaders and weapons, the remaining protesters began to disperse on their own. "That was remarkably efficient," admitted Counselor Vrain. "Begin Scenario 4, Commander Thex announced." There was a note of uncertainty in the commander's voice now. "Multiple armed intruders. A team of well-equipped raiders has taken control of a mining facility. They are heavily armed and have threatened to destroy valuable equipment if approached." The holographic environment shifted to show a complex industrial facility with multiple levels and numerous hiding places. David could see at least 8 armed figures positioned throughout the structure, all carrying military-grade weapons. This scenario was designed to require a full squad of Federation troops working together with careful coordination and extensive planning. David studied the facility layout for 20 seconds. Then he began to move. What happened next would be talked about in Federation military circles for years to come. David did not approach the facility cautiously. He did not attempt to negotiate or establish communication. He did not wait for backup or develop an elaborate tactical plan. He began systematically hunting the raiders through their own stronghold. The council members watched in growing amazement as David turned the industrial facility into a maze where he was the predator and the heavily armed raiders were the prey. He used the environment itself as a weapon, turning off lights to create darkness, using machinery noise to mask his movement, even causing equipment malfunctions to distract his opponents. This is not how Federation forces operate. The rock-skinned being observed quietly. "No," agreed Counselor Vrain. "It is not." One by one, the holographic raiders were eliminated, but David was not simply disabling them in the gentle Federation manner. He was removing them from the fight completely and permanently. Every raider he engaged was left unable to continue fighting, unable to warn their companions, unable to interfere with his mission. The last raider was positioned in the facility's control room, surrounded by valuable equipment and prepared to destroy it if threatened. Standard Federation protocol called for negotiating the surrender of this final opponent. David entered the control room and disabled the raider before the holographic figure could even issue its programmed threats. Scenario complete, Commander Thex announced. All threats neutralized. No equipment damaged. Total elapsed time, 4 minutes, 37 seconds. The observation gallery was completely silent. Counselor Vrain stood up slowly and looked down at David, who was calmly removing his Federation helmet and setting down his weapons. Captain Cross, the tall alien called through the communication system. Yes, Counselor. That was your species fighting according to Federation protocols? David looked up at the observation gallery and smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. No, Counselor. That was me holding back. The alarm systems in the training facility began to chirp softly as David Cross finished adjusting his equipment for the next phase of demonstration. Commander Thex's multiple eyes darted between the control panels and the human standing calmly in the center of the chamber. Captain Cross, came Counselor Vrain's voice through the communication system. We have reviewed your performance in the previous scenarios. Your methods are unconventional. David looked up at the observation gallery where the 7 council members sat in chairs that seemed less comfortable than they had an hour ago. Several of them were leaning forward, studying him with new attention. Unconventional compared to what, Counselor? Compared to standard military doctrine. Your approach seems to prioritize speed and finality over careful tactical development, because speed and finality keep soldiers alive. The bird-like council member ruffled its feathers. But surely there are situations where a more measured approach would be preferable. David set down his Federation weapon and picked up a different piece of equipment from the table. Counselor, may I ask you something? Of course. In your species' military history, what is the longest any single conflict has lasted? The bird-like being consulted with its neighbors before responding. The merchant route dispute lasted approximately 18 months. That is considered our most extended military engagement. 18 months. David repeated. On Earth, we call that a skirmish. Commander Thex activated the next scenario without waiting for further discussion. The training chamber transformed into what appeared to be a massive space station with multiple levels. Countless corridors and various types of industrial equipment. Scenario 5, announced the commander. Deep strike mission. Enemy forces have captured a strategic facility and are using it to coordinate attacks on civilian targets. Your objective is to penetrate their defenses, neutralize their command structure, and hold the facility until reinforcements arrive. David studied the holographic environment. Unlike the previous scenarios, this one showed clear signs of being designed by military minds rather than peacekeepers. The enemy positions were well fortified with overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. Enemy strength? David asked. Approximately 60 combatants with military training and heavy weapons. They have had 3 days to prepare their defenses and are expecting an assault. David nodded and began moving toward the facility's outer perimeter. What happened next made Commander Thex's multiple eyes blink in rapid sequence. Instead of studying the enemy defenses or developing an assault plan, David began modifying his equipment. He dismantled part of his Federation armor and used the components to create what appeared to be improvised explosive devices. What is he doing? Asked the water being nervously. He is building weapons that do not exist in our arsenal, Commander Thex replied after checking the sensor readings. David approached the facility's main entrance, where holographic guards maintained a checkpoint with heavy weapons and energy barriers. Standard Federation doctrine called for either a frontal assault with superior numbers or a prolonged siege. David walked directly toward the checkpoint. The holographic guards challenged him, raised their weapons, and activated their defensive systems. David raised his hands as if surrendering, then dropped to the ground as the improvised devices he had hidden around the checkpoint detonated simultaneously. Used himself as bait, observed the metal being with what might have been admiration. Inside the facility, David moved through the corridors like he was reading a map only he could see. The enemy defenders had prepared for conventional assault tactics, but David was not using conventional tactics. When enemies established ambush positions, he did not try to fight through them. Instead, he went around them, above them, or under them. When they set traps, he turned the traps against their creators. When they tried to coordinate their defense, He systematically eliminated their communication systems. "How does he know where to go?" asked the rock-skinned council member. "He has never seen this facility before." Commander Thex checked the readings again. "He is not following our tactical databases. He appears to be reading the facility's design and predicting enemy behavior based on structural logic." Predicting behavior. He knows where they will position their defenses because he understands how they think. David had reached the facility's command center, where the enemy's leadership was coordinating their defense. The holographic commanders had surrounded themselves with guards and established multiple layers of security standard. Federation approach called for a careful assault with maximum force to minimize casualties on both sides. David did something that made several council members stand up in their chairs. He triggered a systematic failure of the facility's life support systems. "What is he doing now?" demanded Councillor Vrain. "He is using the station's own systems as weapons," Commander Thex replied in a voice that sounded slightly strained. "Atmosphere controls, artificial gravity, power distribution, emergency systems. Everything is being turned against the defenders." The enemy forces inside the command center found themselves dealing with failing gravity, dropping air pressure, fluctuating power levels, and emergency alarms that made coordination impossible. Within minutes, they were more focused on survival than on maintaining their defense. David entered the command center and systematically disabled the remaining defenders while they struggled with environmental hazards. "Scenario complete," announced Commander Thex. "Objective achieved." Time elapsed, 12 minutes 43 seconds, but David did not stop moving. Instead of securing the facility and waiting for reinforcements as the scenario required, he began moving toward another section of the station. "Captain Cross," called Commander Thex, "the scenario is complete. You have achieved your objectives." "I am preventing counterattack," David replied without slowing down. "There is no counterattack programmed into this scenario. There is always a counterattack." David had identified the facility's armory and was systematically disabling the weapons stored there. Then he moved to the communications center and destroyed the equipment that could be used to call for help. Finally, he positioned himself at the facility's main docking bay and began preparing defenses against reinforcements that existed. Only in his tactical calculations, he is not just completing the mission, observed the water being. He is ensuring that the enemy cannot recover from their defeat. "Ever," added the bird-like council member quietly. Commander Thex activated the communication system. "Captain Cross, we would like to begin the final scenario. I am ready. Scenario 6, Last Stand Defense. You are the sole survivor of a defeated military unit. Enemy forces are advancing on your position with overwhelming numbers. Your mission is to delay their advance as long as possible to allow civilian evacuation." The training chamber transformed into a defensive position at the top of a hill overlooking a valley. Enemy forces were visible in the distance, moving toward David's position in organized formations. Based on the numbers, any reasonable tactical analysis would conclude that defense was impossible. "Enemy strength?" David asked. "Approximately 300 combatants with armor support and artillery. Estimated time until your position is overrun, 30 minutes. David studied the battlefield for exactly 10 seconds. Then he began moving down the hill toward the advancing enemy forces. "Where is he going?" asked Councillor Vrain. "He is advancing toward a force that outnumbers him 300 to 1, Commander Thex replied with evident disbelief. "That is not a defensive strategy." "No, Councillor, that is not a defensive strategy. What happened next would be remembered by every council member for the rest of their lives." David did not attempt to hold his defensive position. Instead, he turned the entire battlefield into a weapon. He used the terrain to create avalanches that crushed enemy formations. He turned the enemy's own artillery against them by redirecting their targeting systems. He even used the holographic projectors in the training facility to create false targets that drew enemy fire away from his actual position. The 300 attackers found themselves fighting not just one human, but the landscape itself. Every rock, every tree, every piece of equipment became part of David's arsenal. "This is impossible," whispered the metal being. "No," said Commander Thex quietly. "This is what happens when someone fights without any limitations." The battle continued for 47 minutes. When it ended, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The enemy force had been completely eliminated. and David stood alone among the wreckage of what had once been an overwhelming assault. "Scenario complete," Commander Thex announced in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper. David removed his helmet and looked up at the observation gallery. His expression was calm and professional, as if he had just completed a routine training exercise. "Counselors, is there anything else you would like to see?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Counselor Vrain found its voice. "Captain Cross, in that last scenario, you were supposed to be the sole survivor of a defeated unit." "Yes." "You were supposed to delay the enemy advance for 30 minutes." "Yes." "Instead, you eliminated the entire enemy force." "Yes." "How is that possible?" David was quiet for a moment while he considered his answer. "Counselor Vrain, your scenarios are designed around the concept of acceptable losses. The idea that some objectives are worth sacrificing soldiers to achieve, and that some enemies are too strong to defeat completely. That is correct. Human military doctrine does not accept that premise." "What do you mean?" David looked around the observation gallery at 7 beings who were beginning to understand that everything they thought they knew about warfare was incomplete. "We do not fight to delay the enemy. We fight to destroy them. We do not fight to minimize our losses. We fight to eliminate theirs. We do not fight to achieve acceptable outcomes. We fight to win so completely that our enemies can never threaten anyone." Again, Counselor Vrain descended from its platform and approached the transparent wall that separated the observation gallery from the training chamber. "Captain Cross, what you just demonstrated. Could other humans do the same?" David picked up his travel bag and prepared to leave the training facility. "Counselor, what I just demonstrated is what we teach in basic training." The emergency council session convened 30 minutes after David's demonstration ended. The 7 beings sat around their platforms in the Grand Assembly Hall, but the atmosphere was completely different from their first meeting with the human representative. Counselor Vrain no longer carried itself with the same confident authority. Its musical voice had taken on a cautious tone. The recording systems captured everything. Analysis teams are still processing the data, but preliminary reports indicate that Captain Cross achieved tactical results that our military doctrine considers impossible. The bird-like council members' feathers were disheveled. Impossible is the correct word. One individual eliminated over 2,000 simulated opponents while simultaneously turning our own training facility into a weapon system. The facility managers estimate it will take 3 days to repair the damage to the simulation systems, added the rock-skinned being. Apparently, the human discovered interactions between our technologies that we did not know existed. David sat in the center chair, listening to the council discuss his performance with expressions that ranged from amazement to barely concealed fear. The water being made nervous bubbling sounds. "Captain Cross, we need to understand something. How many humans possess these capabilities?" David looked around the chamber before answering. "All of them." "All of them?" "Every human who completes basic military training can do what I just demonstrated. My performance was adequate, but not exceptional by human standards." Counselor Vrain leaned forward. "Not exceptional? I am a career military officer with extensive combat experience, but any human soldier with proper training could have achieved similar results in that simulation." The metal being's single eye focused on David like a targeting system. "How many soldiers does Earth have? Active military personnel across all branches and planetary colonies? Approximately 400 million. The number hit the council like a physical blow. Several members made sounds of distress. 400 million? The bird-like being's voice rose to a high pitch. "You have 400 million individuals capable of what we just witnessed? That is just active military. Earth maintains a reserve force of approximately 1 billion additional personnel who have completed military service and can be recalled to duty if needed." Counselor Vrain stood up slowly. "Captain Cross, are you telling us that humanity has over 1 billion trained soldiers?" "Yes. And they can all fight the way you just demonstrated?" "Better," David replied calmly. "I am 44 years old and past my physical peak. A 20-year-old human marine would have completed that simulation faster, and with less resource expenditure. The silence in the chamber was complete except for the soft hum of life support systems. The water being finally broke the quiet. "Captain, we need to understand your species' military organization. Who commands these forces? Each planetary government maintains its own military forces for local defense. Earth's unified command structure coordinates major operations and interplanetary conflicts. Colony worlds have their own defense forces but can request support from Earth if needed. And who makes the decision to use these forces? David considered the question carefully. That depends on the scale of the threat. Local commanders can respond to immediate dangers. Regional conflicts require approval from planetary governments. Large-scale military operations require approval from Earth's Defense Council. How long does such approval take? For a major military deployment? If the threat is confirmed, approximately 6 hours. The rock-skinned council member made a grinding sound. 6 hours to deploy 1 billion soldiers? Oh no, David corrected. 6 hours to approve deployment. Actual mobilization would begin immediately upon threat confirmation. Advance forces could be engaged within hours. Full deployment would take approximately 72 hours. Counselor Vrain walked down from its platform and approached David's chair. Up close, the alien's pale features showed signs of stress. Captain Cross, we need to ask you something, and we need a completely honest answer. Go ahead. Your species' history of warfare. The millions of casualties you mentioned. The constant conflicts. Was all of that preparation? David looked up at the towering alien. Preparation for what? For something like this. For a time when your military skills would be needed by others. David was quiet for a long moment. Counselor Vrain, human wars were not fought to prepare for anything. They were fought because that is what humans do when we disagree about something important. But the result is that you have become the most militarily capable species in the galaxy. That appears to be true. The bird-like council member spoke from its platform. Captain, what would happen if humanity encountered a truly hostile alien species? Something that threatened Earth directly? We would destroy them. The simple certainty in David's voice made several council members recoil. Destroy them completely? Yes. What if they were more technologically advanced than humanity? We would adapt their technology and use it against them. What if they outnumbered your forces? We would find a way to even the odds. What if they had superior weapons? We would take their weapons and improve them. Counselor Vrain returned to its platform and addressed the other council members. We need to vote on humanity's application for Federation membership. Before we vote, the metal being interjected, we need to discuss the implications of what we have learned. Which are, we have discovered a species that is essentially a military superpower. Their entire civilization has been shaped by constant warfare. They possess capabilities that exceed our understanding of what individual soldiers can accomplish. The water being made agitated bubbling sounds, and we were considering rejecting their application because we thought they were too primitive. The question now, said the rock-skinned being, is whether we can afford to have them as members, or whether we can afford not to. Counselor Vrain called for order. We will vote on 3 separate questions. First, should humanity be granted membership in the Galactic Federation? The vote was unanimous in favor. Second, should humanity be granted full military authority within Federation space? Again, unanimous in favor. Third, should we request that humanity take primary responsibility for Federation defense operations? This time the vote took longer, but it was still unanimous. David watched the proceedings with professional interest. Counselors, I should point out that I have no authority to accept military responsibilities on behalf of Earth's government. Of course, Counselor Vrain replied. These votes simply establish the Federation's position. Formal negotiations will need to be conducted between our governments. I understand. The bird-like being ruffled its feathers nervously. Captain Cross, may we ask what you think Earth's response will be to our requests? David stood up from his chair and looked around the chamber. That depends on what you are asking us to do. Protect Federation. Space from external threats, that is reasonable. Maintain peace between member species. Acceptable. Respond to emergencies and crises that exceed the capabilities of local forces. Standard peacekeeping operations, yes, Counselor. Vrain hesitated before asking the next question. And if we encounter a threat that requires the full application of human military doctrine? David looked directly at the tall alien. Then you will see what happens when humanity stops holding back. The council members exchanged glances. Several made sounds that might have been nervous laughter. Captain, the water being asked quietly. Exactly how much were you holding back in today's demonstration? David picked up his travel bag and prepared to return to his shuttle. When he reached the chamber's exit, he paused and looked back at the 7 alien beings who would never again think of humans as a primitive species. Counselor, today I was a single soldier, using non-lethal weapons in a training facility with safety protocols active, fighting holographic opponents who could not actually hurt me. And I was trying not to break your equipment. David walked out of the assembly hall, leaving the council to contemplate the implications of what they had just witnessed. Behind him, 7 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations began the process of completely restructuring their military doctrine around a simple principle: never fight humans. Always fight with them. 3 days later, Earth's Defense Council received a formal request from the Galactic Federation. The message was brief and direct. The Federation formally requests that humanity assume primary responsibility for the defense of galactic civilization. Terms of engagement: unlimited. Rules of engagement: human discretion. Command authority: absolute. Compensation: full partnership in galactic governance and unlimited access to Federation technology and resources. Earth's reply was equally brief: accepted. Deployment begins immediately. The galaxy would never be the same.